I'm going to try to fly through about 700 slides. Actually reduced to 102 when I was sitting back there. And then followed by a fire chat, and then followed by questions. But really, the most important point I'd like to make is a bit about why we're focusing on the brain. It's not exactly the century for the brain, because if you look at the investigation and people looking at the brain, it goes back to thousands of years. Plato, Aristotle, and Heraclitus were debating where does this whole business of the mind exist. And everybody settled about 1,000 years ago that it's in the brain, in the gut, and in the heart. And then several thousand years later, we actually discovered that there's truth to that. But most importantly, what interests me and why I'm looking at the brain is that it's the organ where the seat of consciousness. It's the organ that we're modeling AI after. It's the organ that proclaimed with intelligence. Everything that you do, you sense, you control. Modern medicine says there is some kind of footprint in the brain. For me particularly, I was interested in investigation of the brain since I was really young. It was just a fascinating thing with a father who was a scientist. But later as I grow up, I was actually hit with a TBI, traumatic brain injury. And consequently, I had to face the consequence of modern medicine and see how you can correct your brain back to normal. And I discovered that we are way backward. So in a non-linear way of telling the story and now infuse into it what happens that causes TBI. I actually did not work on the brain all my entire career. I was a government scientist for about 11 years in crypto activities. I was trained as a mathematician in Oxford, and I had nothing to do with the brain in that part. Later on, I decided to study medicine. As a result of studying medicine, other than anecdotal things that we know about the brain, that you got a cooling and air conditioning that goes from here to the moon called the blood vessels, 3 pounds, the different types, white matters, gray matters, we discovered that actually the whole thing structurally looked the same, but functionally different. We discovered that behaviorally, what can be functionally and structurally similar can actually differ also in behavior. But in the diseased mind, and here's where I'm going to fast forward. This is what we actually use today as modern medicine. You go for anxiety, you come out with depression. You go for depression, you come out with bipolar. You go for bipolar, you come out with schizophrenics. And the story goes on, right? Because we know very little about the brain, despite the fact that we can say it's an electrical machine or a chemical machine or whatnot. So my team at Oxford and at MIT, we started investigating into the brain as it might be a machine that does something completely different than what we think it does. It might not be analog, it might be digital. It might be actually optical. But how is it optical when there's no access to light and so forth? The pharmaceutical approach that I just showed earlier is whack-a-mole. Essentially, as I said, you just don't get to a right solution and resolution. Why? Because we don't know what we're fighting for. So, in taking the brain as an optical machine, I'm gonna, as I said, as I promised, I fast forward. I took the school of thoughts of quantitative self and the school of thoughts of augmented self, and started looking at data in a slightly different way, so, for activities of daily living data, and started looking at the augmented self from a machine that can interface with the brain. So the vision that I set as a goal was in a group called NI2O, Neurons Input to Output. That's a company that was set up for me by Oxford University to kind of toy around with this whole idea of a brain-machine interface that is also a DBS, a deep brain stimulation. Here's the fundamental difference in the school of thought, since most of us saw Elon Musk's talks and others. In the brain-machine interface, there seems to be a goal about recording your memory and uploading it somewhere, and then actually live longer off of that, right? In the deep brain stimulation, it's specifically therapeutical. It is specifically about going into a specific region of the brain and stimulating it so that you can get a therapeutic effect. So in augmented self, also if you want to do DPS or PCI or BMI, you actually have to think about the intrusive nature of some of this technology and how you actually get it to the brain, right? So in the case of Elon Musk's technology or Neuralink, they're talking about surface cortical, where you're actually listening to the brain signal from the surface cortical and not deep into the layers of the cortex. In the case of DPS, you actually care about going deep into the cortex. So specifically from a case study on Parkinson, you would have to get into an area called the subthalamic nucleus or the basal ganglia and put in an electrical pulsation wire that pulsate electricity at very low frequency, low voltage, and then restore hopefully what was damaged. In our case, this created a necessity for actually a number of what is the number of neural interface and the connectivity and the resolution and so forth. And I'm going to fast forward. This is the scary looking surgery. Yes, it is actually one of the most barbaric surgery that we do in neurosurgery, and it is the state of the art, sadly. Now, in order to get into the brain, whether you're doing DBS or you're doing BMI or BCI, you have to understand what is this neuron saying to each other. And then today what they're saying to each other is something called a spike train, or just basically intervals of signal. And we reduce the problem into a signal analysis problem. And that's essentially the state of the art as being presented by the most advanced group like Neuralink and whatnot. Well, we differ from that. We're saying that's not correct. That's not what this sophisticated machine actually communicating. It communicates things way beyond that. It has a complexity and a sophistication to come really close to a quantum machine, but we don't understand it. So we had to actually design and orchestrate something which I refer to as a fundamental code unit, meaning if two neurons talking to each other, what is the currency that they're talking in? And what are they actually saying to each other? And through a level of laborious mathematics and a period of suffering of about 8 years, we discovered something called the fundamental code unit, which is essentially mounted to two primes that actually factorizing and an entire system that's called the unitary mathematical system that govern the brain rather than the binary, which is what everybody goes after. Fast forward through that. So I gave a lecture a while back. I said how you can almost fix everything with the brain. So if I have access with light, if I have access to the brain, to the cortical space, I'm able to flash light to turn on or off specific neurons, therefore be able to alter the functions, almost like transistor, right? So evolutionary, what that tells me that this box is the most sophisticated computer you'd ever come across, which differs from, if I actually split this room into half, I'll find 50% that believe in singularity, 50% that doesn't believe in singularity. And we're in the land of singularity in California. Therefore, I would say that my school of thought, or my approach toward it, is that the brain is the most sophisticated computer that ever exists. It just needs some help, because over thousands and millions of years of evolution, this brain lost a lot of faculty, lost a lot of capabilities. IQs went down. And how do we correct that? Essentially by coming up with devices that support the brain, prosthetic to the brain. All right, so optogenetics, I won't belabor this. Essentially, you flash a light and whatnot. What is the process of doing that? We induce a friendly virus called Edna Virus. It expresses itself, it modifies the actual neurons, and causes these neurons to be photosensitive. and then I'm able to manipulate by delivering light into that space. Still, how am I going to deliver light into that space?
Is it okay to introduce that virus?
Right, so Edna Virus is approved by FDA for therapeutic purposes, and it's short-lived virus. It doesn't live for long, so it lives just long enough for me to do the correction and then bring things back to health, and then it gets phagocytized or it gets eaten, the immune system kills it.
Virus in, optogenetics happen, you do the healing, the therapeutic effect, then it goes away.
Yeah. So when we get to the actual, anybody cares to actually see how that happens? Yeah. The protein? Can you hit play on that? Yeah. Oh, you can't, okay. No, well, it's a protein segment married to the neurons. The neuron then re-expresses something called neuropsin sites. It becomes, think of it as a solar panel that just got installed on the roof of your house. Now all of a sudden you can actually make sense of the sun or can make use of the light and whatnot. And it gets carrying the message. You have channels that opens on or off potassium and sodium. So once it goes into one of these states, it's almost like a switch on or off. What happens in people that have anxiety and depression and whatnot, something gets stuck. There's a whole separate new theory to what is depression that is being discussed recently, which I won't get into right this second. But back at MIT, we were actually looking at, this is essentially the evolution of artificial intelligence to artificial consciousness, machine learning to learning machine, and brain modeling to brain augmentation, where the area that we're at. That was the mind machine project that she talked about earlier. So I'm going to fast forward to show you the actual device that we came up with. Okay.
And so you're identifying patients that have Parkinson's to start? Is that it?
Right. So Parkinson is one of the many conditions you can treat with this. You can treat bulimia nervosa, depression, anxiety, Parkinson, Alzheimer, MS, whatnot.
And you're finding the location within the brain to input the neuroprosthetic that's the size of a grain of rice.
Yes.
And then it's able to do the the virus, the optogenetics, that entire process that you described.
Right. So the device, which is, you're essentially looking at it right now, that's probably the first time I ever shown this out outside of some of the design. And I actually have a prototype that we'll show after. It's very small. It gets implanted to the area. Like in the case of Parkinson, we know that there's dopamine vesicles that are not secreting. It's in the subthalamic nucleus. So you go to that area, you place the device. It's made out of a carbon nanotubes, which is a completely departure from the classical norm of how these devices are. Carbon nanotubes is a material that is accepted by the body, so it doesn't get attacked by your autoimmune system. The neurons is then start growing on the on this microtubicle, and the system expresses propagation of a signal, pulse-generated signal. This pulse-generated signal causes the person, which you will see in the end of this video, we can't play video, but you'll see a person in the end who is basically has Parkinson, and immediately after the surgical intervention, they're able to move and walk about and whatnot.
This is your team?
Yes.
And how many times have you done this successfully?
We've done deep brain stimulation surgical interventions over 900 times successfully. Wow. And not me personally credited with that, that's the team in Oxford. And the brain-computer interface component, we should have it ready in about 2 months. We found that the sci-fi sounds good. Very interesting. That's amazing. Perfect timing. Perfect timing.
See, that's the signal from Mother, from our universe saying, "Are you sure, humans?"
So I will leave it to your questions later to answer some of the. I mean, there are obviously implications, ethical and otherwise, and we're sensitive to them, and I love to discuss them openly when they come up. The light range frequency that we were able to control is 380 to 470, which is the visible light frequency, which means that you don't actually have to drill laser equipment in the brain or anything like that. I'm flashing a normal, ordinary light with just different color variations. This is some early illustrations of the device. There are three things that our system is, three components that are made out of. The kiwi, which is the actual uptrode electrode. A system called NOAA, which stands for Neurons on Augmented Human, which is actually an operating system that mimics the brain. And then a propagator, which is a way station to do the inductive charging and the battery and dealing with the power. This is the actual device. If you look up here on the big clunky thing, which is the current state of the art in DPS, you find a tiny, tiny chip attached on it. That's the kiwi before the encapsulation, the hermetic encapsulation, and the propagator on one side and the kiwi on the other side. Here it is again. Our migration path from actually technological point of view, we're actually aiming for a patch that you put on your body somewhere, and it hacks its way back to your brain. So essentially, there will be no surgery whatsoever. We're years ahead of that, but this is where we're at today. This is from the DARPA government grant goal, impact, and vision. And then we essentially had to design like an earbud that communicate with the kiwi implant in a real loop to actually give you the behavioral assessment if there's any changes in your behavioral assessment as a result of the surgical intervention. Otherwise it plays kick-ass music, actually. All right, so for those who want to geek out on the design and want to discuss it later in deeper details, I'm more than glad to actually do that. And this is the carbon nanotubes, how it looks. They're quite amazing. They grow on gold and under severe heat. Okay, and I want to show you the gentleman.
You think you can get this down to a patch on the skin and have it communicate with the brain?
Yeah, we believe
the body.
That is doable in about 5 to 10 years. With your brain, with your cell structure, everything. It requires that we understand the pathways in the brain. So we have to go intrusive first, and then revert back to non-intrusive once we understand the pathway to the signal pathway. This is the gentleman that I was referring to. Unfortunately, we can't play it because of the format that I put it in, which is PDF. Sorry for that. If anybody from the company that makes PDF, I'm sorry. That could have been prevented. And now he's going to ask me questions, and then you can ask me questions. And
yeah, this is very, very cool, Noon. So the team, so you guys have done 900 of these now, and all of those have been for Parkinson's. Is that right?
Yeah, mostly Parkinson's, bulimia nervosa, and then some other drug-resistant depression.
Wow, okay, so that's obviously huge. So many of us have family members that are in their times of going out of life, and so with the technology like yours, it could potentially then offset a bunch of the neurodegenerative diseases, potentially, and then prolong our lives, and then we have to solve all the other things that come up. And then, so let's talk about this on a, this is obviously, this is invasive to start. You hope to make it not invasive down the line. So what exactly is, like, just teach us a little bit about the hardware and software component. Okay, there's a little grain of rice that goes inside. What is it, how is it, 10,000 neurons is connected to 1 million? How many is it connected to? How are you reading that? And how are you making sense of how to stimulate with optogenetics, which neurons, all this type of stuff? It's so complex up there.
Sure. So the journey of this device is that a person comes in, have, God forbid, Parkinson or a neurodegenerative disorder of some sort. Every neurodegenerative disorder implicates a particular area, very, very small area. Like in the case of Parkinson, the vesicles are very, very small. We go to this projection zone. How we go through to this projection zone is through the nasal cavity, and it's called craniofacial as opposed to craniotomy. So we don't have to actually open the brain like in the crazy barbaric thing that you just saw.
You're going through the nasal cavity?
Nasal cavity and upper part of the gum. In some cases, you would have to actually go through the back of the brain if the region that is implicated there. Once you put the device in the zone of projection, the device has a built-in battery, a system on a chip, complete processing capability equivalent to, it's probably much, much slower than your iPhone, but it's capable to what you have in your iPhone. It's got the ability to actually charge inductively, meaning from an external source outside of the brain, every 72 hours. And we embed that in a pillow. Right? Or in a cab.
I'm getting charged while I'm sleeping on my pillow.
You're getting charged, essentially, yeah.
And have we done longitudinal testing?
Not yet. Not yet. We're still barely in the early phases of small animals on actual full encapsulation. You have to realize that this technology is developed in phases. The first phase of this technology is a pulse generator, which is a standard pulse generator. And then the second phase of it is the brain-computer interface, and then the third phase is actually the brain-machine interface, where you can actually control various means. But going back to the earlier part of how it's operated, once you install it, it senses the presence of these neuron vesicles, and it measures the gradients of these neurons and its capabilities, thereby creating a modulation recipe that goes back and gets reversed and injected into this area. When that happens, the dopamine vesicles that either were not secreting or not doing very well, but not yet dead. The intervention does not account for when these have completely died. If they have completely died, there exists a replacement for them that they're waiting to attach to a scaffold. Something called the scaffolding effect, meaning that they need something to actually live on and grow on. The kiwi becomes that scaffold, with or without the power, becomes that ability to regrow. It carries in its tubercle a payload of the Edna virus as well as other therapeutic measures. The system knows what to release based on that read and write full loop, and with the support of the doctor is able to introduce the therapy that is necessary. All that information gets shuttled out to the propagator, which is either you have it installed really close or it's actually a mobile device, depending on the patient. All of that gets shuttled back to third-tier architecture in the cloud, where you have the heavy lifting and the external learning. Then it gets pushed back all the way to the kiwi again as necessary. And it's all governed by very rigid security apparatus that does not allow for a hacking or break-in or any of that stuff. In fact, the system can completely shut down and not be receptive to any of these things and still be working. Are we over time?
No, we want to open it up to, we'll
okay.
open up to the floor.
Okay.
Someone, yeah, go ahead. And yeah, go ahead. You can reach it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. This was brilliant. But it sounds a little bit like nuclear energy, whereas we can either build a bomb or build, free energy for the entire world. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on what are the pros and cons of invasive and non-invasive brain devices, specifically those related to the ones that might allow humans to become slaves of machines. So I would love to hear your thoughts on.
Sure.
Thank you.
Let's start by saying that the universe of thinkers is broken into the category of those who want a machine to become like a human, and those who want a human to become like a machine. And then there is something in between where we want to restore human dignity. Right, that's what we normally say, is that we want to go back and correct what went wrong. right? The invasiveness versus the non-invasive technology that exists today, it is just as invasive. Meaning, if I'm actually projecting some electrical pulsation of a low current on my surface of the cortex, it's low power that is not penetrating deeply. If I'm using DPS by Medtronic, Boston Scientific, and EBITS and whatnot, I'm penetrating deeply. Either way, I'm altering the electrophysiology, the chemical construct, the neurotransmitters levels, everything. So the way I think of it is, if we're going to do it, we might as well do it right? By understanding the full spectrum, by actually getting to know the brain intricacies and the details of how it's working in a proper way. The closest map that is done by Allen Institute does not reach to the resolution of the brain. When you get to the brain's smallest element, to the neurons, and you start talking about dendrite trees and the number of photon sites on the dendrite trees and the number of photon to electron exchanges happening on each photon sites and whatnot, you go to 10 to the minus 19th, right? So that is somewhere around the distance between here and another known universe. That's incredible. We have not gotten anywhere near that resolution or understanding yet, and I'm hoping by this technology we're able to actually achieve that. Other ethical implications, security implications and whatnot that associate with that, but that associates with everything else, and the design has to be right from the first order in order to avoid some of these pitfalls and bad problems.
Two more questions.
I was just wondering.
Oh, yeah, plug her back.
This
Yeah.
device
Thank you.
could be adapted for people. I was just wondering if this device could be adapted for people with intractable pain.
We did some, sorry. Thank you. I believe, and this is hypothesizing, that wherever we're interacting with the neurons, we're able to actually affect change. The concept that I haven't introduced in the presentation, we refer to it as the brain code. And the brain code is a library of sort of like the diseases out there. There are people among you here in the room where we're actually investing and empowering into building some of these disorders and accelerating some of these brain codes. And some of the categories is pain and migraine.
Let's go over here. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead and just say it.
What do you think Neuralink is doing right and what do you think they're doing wrong? I'm just curious about someone who's very interested in Neuralink, hearing about this. This is fascinating. What are your thoughts on Neuralink more generally?
Repeat the question.
Sure. What is Neuralink doing right and what they're doing wrong? Is that correct? Does that sum it? Yeah. So there is this concept from the lab to the market. And where I have talked about this for the last 10, 12 years, and then people would be like, what? What is this whole thing all about? I think what Neuralink did right is that they created a familiar environment for brain-machine interface, for brain-computer interface, for DPS, for the broad category of whatnot. Based strictly on the presentation that I saw from Neuralink recently, they haven't done anything that we have done in the last 12 years. So they took experimental results and things that were done by DARPA and others, and then packaged it really, really nicely with a very nice team, and put out there a positive foot forward. Certainly they have the resources and the means to go further and further than most people. I haven't heard anything about the security details of the system. I didn't see the size reduction, the technique, surgical technique improvement, or any of that stuff. But then again, that's in the works. I don't really have an insight into their design wins. Wherever Elon Musk shed lights on an issue, everybody It's a herd mentality. They go and listen. Sometimes we don't hear everything we want to hear, but hopefully, hopefully there will be more.
Thank you, Noon.
All right.
Thank you.